Let's start with a little true-false test today, and the first question is, pastor. Pastor is a legitimate office in the New Testament church, and I think all of you would be able to answer true on that one. Second question is, elder. Is the elder a legitimate office in a New Testament church? And I would answer that yes. We don't have to all agree on that, but some churches have an elder-led form of church government, and I don't think that the New Testament necessarily requires that, but I think it certainly allows it, and so I think the answer will be true. And so the next question is, deacon. Is a deacon a legitimate office in a New Testament church? And I think all of us will be comfortable in saying yes there. And the last one is priest. Is the priest a legitimate office in a New Testament church? And we would tend to think, no, that's not right. Catholics do that, and we don't do that, and so that's not right. But I want to argue today that priest is, in fact, a legitimate office in a New Testament church. So we'll be talking today about the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. And the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers does not teach that we don't need priest. I actually read several commentaries this last week about the idea that that is what it teaches, that we don't need priest. And what they meant was we don't need priests like the Old Testament Jews had priests, or we don't need priests like the Catholics had priests. But I would argue that yes, we do need priests. In fact, we need lots of priests. The priesthood of all believers suggests we need everyone to fulfill their God-given role as a priest. And I would like to look at two key verses from our passage. I actually read through the whole passage, and you might want to do that today and discuss a few things along the way as you go through it to kind of set the context. But we are so limited in time. I'm going to focus our attention on two key verses, 1 Peter 2:5. You also, like living stones, and the picture that is being described in this passage is of the church, and the idea is that if you're just a rock out by itself, that's one thing, but if you put that rock in a wall and make it part of a building, then it has much greater value, and that's the picture he's painting of the New Testament church. And he says, you are like living stones being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. We are all part of a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then 4 verses later, 1 Peter 2:9, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of his darkness into his wonderful light. And we want to talk today about what does it mean that we are all priests. And the first thing it means is priests represent people before God. Priests represent people before God. Priests come into the Holy of Holies and come before God and represent the needs of the people in their world. First thing that God wanted to teach his people is he called them out of slavery and called them to be a nation, had to do with the holiness of God. And it's always a little tricky to pit one attribute of God against another. But if you had to say that one attribute of God is more important than all the rest, my pick would be holy, holy, holy. It's the only attribute of God that's mentioned 3 times that way. We don't read about mercy, 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 or faithfulness, 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 or love, 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 but we read about holy, holy, holy. And you can see this in a number of ways, and a lot of kind of puzzling commands in Leviticus and so on about not having cloth that has 2 different kinds of materials sewn in it. And it all has to do with this idea of separateness. But this is seen, I think, especially in the way the temple was set up. And first, the tabernacle was set up. You see a picture here. And the idea is that we didn't want people just bumbling into the presence of God. And God doesn't want people referring to him as my old man upstairs. He doesn't want people saying the name of God without thinking about the purpose of the person of God. And that's what it means to take the Lord's name in vain, not to curse with the Lord's name so much as just simply to use the Lord's name in a flippant way without thinking about the person of God. And you see this again in the tabernacle. And God didn't want people just stumbling into the presence of God. And so there was this outer tent for starters, and then you walked into the gateway into the tabernacle. And the first thing you would find there is the altar where sacrifices were offered. And it taught the people that we are sinners and that someone has to pay for our sin. And then there was this laver where we would wash up before we went into the temple proper. And we get into the temple proper, we see the outer part, the holy place, where the altar of incense is there representing the prayers of the people, and the lampstand representing the light of the world, and the showbread that Jesus is the bread of life, and so on. We see that outer veil. You notice that the outer covering of the temple has 4 different layers there, and it all has to do with this idea of separateness. I draw your attention to that inner veil, and that's the veil where we read about in Matthew where it says, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. But this whole temple was there to illustrate the idea that God is holy, God is separate. You can't just barge into the presence of God. Later, the temple was built on the same design, and you see a picture of it here. We see, I showed my people kind of into archaeology and so on, so I showed them also a picture of modern Jerusalem and the temple ground where the Dome of the Rock is. On the inside of that Dome of the Rock, we see the rock where historically or traditionally we see that Abraham offered his son Isaac. On the left side of that temple ground, we find the Wailing Wall, which is the oldest part of the temple ground, where Jews go today to offer prayers at this kind of sacred place. But this tabernacle and the temple was all set up to teach the people that God is holy, holy, holy. And in Hebrews 10, beginning in verse 19, we read, "Therefore, as brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter this most holy place by the blood of Jesus." And it's easy for us to read that and just kind of gloss over this little phrase, but this writing to Hebrews would have gotten their attention, and they would realize that only the priest could go into that most holy place. Only once a year, after he had offered sacrifices, after he had cleansed himself, and as a representative of the people, he would go into that most holy place. And the writer of Hebrews says that we, as Christians, go into that